needs to hide these things everywhere.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Raluca, for that very generous introduction. Thanks to the organisers, yourself and Anne and Patrick, I don't know if he's here, for doing all the work to bring us all here together. Also to Sakari and to Laura for instigating this remarkable series of conferences. I was at Turku 2 years ago and also at the workshop in Lisbon this spring that Sakari mentioned. I'm absolutely delighted that this concept is taking off. I think it's a very, very rich concept. I think one of the most important consequences of it, of the Trextuality model for translation studies, is its decisive overturning of the various binaries that structured most translation analysis for so many years. And I'm talking about the binaries that once pitted the translation against the putative original, or the translator against the author, or the target language against the source language. I think thanks to the kind of scholarship that's been done under this rubric, we now know that the notion of the original text rarely stands up to any kind of scrutiny. When we actually start excavating, we find that there is no definitive ur-text at all. There's just a whole kind of chain of texts, versions of versions stretching back into the mists of time. Also multiple agents involved, many different languages, typically including non-verbal languages. So in this lecture, I'm going to argue that the Trextuality concept can also be profitably applied to music, since the phenomenon of translational layering is observable in this domain as well. I'm going to structure my talk into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to be looking in general terms at the various translational operations that are involved in the production and the reproduction of music, from the editorial operations involved in preparing a score, to the interpretive decisions taken during performance, and then the various reworkings that take place downstream as the piece is appropriated by arrangers and other composers for their own distinct purposes, and other artists as well. Then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to be looking at a case study of one particularly well-known work to show how these maneuvers operate in practice. I'd like to start with a disclaimer, acknowledgement. This talk uses material from a book I'm writing, it's nearly finished, called Translationality in Music, which ought to be published by Routledge next year. Now, as it happened, inspiration for that book and this talk actually came from somebody who's sitting here today, Piotr Blumczynski, whose book, Experiencing Translationality, has a little section at the end called precisely Translationality in Music. And when I was reading this, it really got my ideas going. Things started buzzing in my brain. As I've been interested in translation and music for a long time, as Raluca mentioned, I started thinking that I really should do something with this. So I sent in the proposal to Routledge, and here we are. So thank you very much, Piotr, for getting the ball rolling, and also for your valuable criticism of the proposal too, since. Okay, so let's begin. It won't go down. Oh, there it is. That's me, aged about 8 or 9. Okay, I started having piano lessons quite early on, but it was only when I got to grade 5 that it started to get really interesting. The teacher I had at that time, she was a concert pianist herself, actually. She wasn't very good with children, but she was in other ways quite inspiring. And it was with her that I began to learn about the intricacies of musical appreciation. For example, I learned to hear how a theme would develop across a work, passing through different moods and harmonic contexts until it eventually became something quite different. Or how various voices could be detected in the harmonic mix, sometimes pushing against each other as if in argument, other times echoing each other playfully, or blending together to form a harmonious whole, and how the relationship between these voices was different in accordance with the place and the time in which the composer was working. So I began to enjoy trying to create on the piano those different voices with their distinctive timbre, trying to add colour and sense through the use of dynamics and texture. And I was fascinated by how quite different musical effects could be created by stressing different aspects of the score. The bass line, for example, or the middle voice, as opposed to the main melody, or that one note in the chord that alters the mood. Now, it was only much later, after I'd got into languages and had started to work as a translator of Portuguese and French, that I realized that what I was doing in the piano was itself a form of translation. That basic act of interpreting those written symbols on the manuscript and transforming them into sound was in all respects analogous to the interlingual translation that I was engaged in my job. So I think it's appropriate that I should begin with a section about musical performance. More precisely, with what is known in the field as the interpretive dilemma. Now that can be summed up in these two quotations. Should the performer interpret the work faithfully, even down to details of historical accuracy, as in the first statement by Daniel Barenboim? Or are we at liberty to make the piece our own, as Ezra Pound famously said, to create our own interpretations, to mess with it as we wish, as in the second? Now, as in translation, this dilemma is partly about status, about the relative status of the translator-performer in relation to the author-composer. Now, the first position, the position of score fidelity, is analogous to exegetical translation, which is done in order to elucidate a high-status foreign text for people that really want to know what it says. So I'm thinking obviously here about the Bible translation tradition, or about the attitude of the German Romantics, the classical texts. However, just as the proponents of descriptive translation studies and functionalism in the 1980s sought to invert the age-old perception of the translator as an uncreative derivative figure by emphasizing their agency in rewriting the work for a new target public, so the proponents of the subjectivist view of musical performance argue that music as an event in time has no a priori existence as notation on the page, but only comes into being when it is performed. However, there are further complications, because even if we believe that it is our duty to faithfully recreate the musical work in performance, what exactly does the work consist of? Is it encapsulated in the marks on the page? So if you think this, like Daniel Barenboim and some of the modernists like Stravinsky and Hanslick, then maximum score compliance is required in performance. Or does the work lie in some more nebulous idea of spirit? Now, this has led to quite different postures. If the spirit of the work is taken to be the composer's intention, beyond what is written in the score, and some scores can be really quite laconic, then we require a kind of genetic criticism style analysis of drafts and secondary manuscripts in an attempt to access the composer's psychological processes. However, the notion of spirit has also been used to justify target-oriented interpretation practices, which aim to make the work more accessible to a new public, often adding new ingredients. So you see, this debate about the work concept in music parallels the distinction in translation studies between word for word and sense for sense. So in each case, it's a debate about where the meaning of the work resides. Now, even greater complexities emerge when the source text is from the very distant past, generated at a time when the cultural, philosophical, and technical conditions of production were very different from those operating in the context of reception. Now, here, the debate hinges upon the question of archaization, whether greater fidelity can be achieved by trying to reproduce the conditions that existed at the time the work was composed. Now, at this point, I would have liked to have gone on to talk about the early music revival, and some of the incoherences that this has thrown up, such as a thriving market for musical relics and pseudo translations as well. But I don't really have time here. So if anyone's interested, ask me about it in the question session. I've got some extra slides on that subject. But for now, I'm just going to close this section with the claim that musical performance is an interpretive act that effectively rewrites a source text for a new purpose and audience, which indisputably brings it under the purview of translation studies. But upstream of any performance, there are a whole range of other translational processes that participate in this rewriting and are directly analogous to those involved in the production of literary texts and therefore susceptible to the Trextuality approach. Now, classically trained musicians, unlike their counterparts in popular music, usually work from printed scores. But just like literary works, these come in various editions, packaged in different ways, with or without interpretive apparatus, and involving different degrees of intervention on the part of the editor. So music editing is also a translational act in that it frames the work to be played in a particular way. For example, neither Mozart nor Haydn regularly used dynamic markings in their manuscripts. And yet any musician who attempts to play their music from a modern edition today will be constrained by plentiful instructions to render certain passages forte, pianissimo, legato, staccato, to introduce ritardandos, accelerandos, all in the interests of expressivity. Now, those instructions have all been inserted by an editor. Now, we just have to compare Mozart's handwritten manuscript of the Requiem with a piano arrangement done by Liszt. So this is actually a romantic translation of a classical source text. Now, you'll see we've got loads and loads of expressions here. You've got pianissimo at the beginning, for example. You've got these hairpin crescendos and diminuendos in the second line. You've got on the top, you've got dots for staccato, you've got stress marks, you've got instructions for pedaling. It's full of expression marks. So modern musical scores then are subject to the same interpretive dilemma as performance. So editors may choose to use the latest musicological scholarship to reconstruct how the piece would have sounded at the time it was composed, or they may seek to reinterpret it in line with some fashionable new aesthetic. So here we've got foreignization versus domestication. Or they may uncritically reproduce a canonical interpretation. These tend to be aimed at amateur musicians rather than professionals, and these are the versions that you might find compiled into an album or packaged as part of the Great Composer series. And then what about the very first edition? What about the kinds of interpretive choices that the very first editor had to make when transcribing a composer's autograph manuscript for print? The transcription is as rife with interpretive acts as the editing processes downstream. You may have various versions of the same work, casting doubts upon which should be taken as the definitive one. You may have drafts of earlier versions showing alternative passages, which for some reason the composer excluded from the final one. You may have passages written in other hands. Indeed, until the 18th century, master composers often had apprentices, just as artists did, who may have intervened in the work in different ways. To take a famous example, we now know that Mozart's Requiem was unfinished when he died, and it was completed by his disciple Franz Süssmayr. And then, of course, there may be technical problems resulting from manuscript damage, illegibility, etc. So just as with ancient literary texts, the act of reconstructing a composer's work requires considerable effort, working with archives, comparing extant versions and later rewritings, etc. And then early manuscripts. Manuscripts dating from before the 17th century cause particular problems because in these cases, as with music written in notation systems from other parts of the world, the transcription effort will be truly a translation in the narrowest sense of the word, in that the work will have to be recreated using a different system of symbols. And as in literary language, there may be semantic gaps. There may be information like rhythm or meter that is missing from the source text, but which the target notation system requires be made explicit. Or the opposite. There may be information present in the source text, but which the target code is unable to represent. So this would be the case for half or quarter tones, for example, or some of the neumes used in Eastern notation system, which operate differentially. Interpretation plays an even bigger role when the music should be transcribed as never been written down before, as in various folk and indigenous traditions. Now, such music may not easily be reduced to the categories determined by the tonal tradition and defy reduction to the Western stave. Now, today, fortunately, software is available for this. But in the past, it was a great challenge, as you can see from this quotation from Frances Densmore. She's one of the first ethnomusicologists to work with American Indian music traditions. So one of the problems with this is that the ethnomusicologists have to tread a fine line between fidelity to the source and the kind of appropriation that is necessary to make the music intelligible to people from outside that tradition. They also have to consider the fact that music in indigenous cultures is not usually conceived in the same way as it is in the West, i.e. as an aesthetic to be listened to for pleasure. I mean, in most indigenous cultures, it will be an inherent part of rituals involving other kinds of performance, such as dance and gesture. There may not even be a word for music as we understand it. And then there are the translational movements happening downstream, such as orchestration, arrangement, and adaptation, all of which have direct analogies in literature. Orchestration or instrumentation is used when a piece is reworked for a different instrumental lineup, with parts of the original score assigned to other instruments. Now, this is often undertaken by the composers themselves as a kind of self-translation, though it may be done by third parties. And it includes things like expanding a keyboard piece into an orchestral work, or the opposite, producing a piano reduction of a fully fledged orchestral work, or transforming a ballet or an opera into a suite. As for arrangement, now this may involve re-orchestration, but with a much greater degree of creativity, in that the musical themes may be developed in different ways. They may be harmonized differently, or they may be given a whole new register. Examples include the concept of variations on a popular theme, which was much favored in the 19th and 20th centuries, when composers would basically take a melody from a canonical or a popular work, and then they would riff on it in their own way. Then adaptation. Now, this is also used when a musical work is translated into a whole new language or medium, perhaps analogous to interlingual or even intersemiotic translation. We might include here jazz or rock versions of classical works, or the incorporation of a work into a film soundtrack. Okay, so now I'm moving on to my second part. So I'm going to, in this part, I'm going to show you how this operates in practice with reference to one particular musical work, Les Sauvages, by Jean-Philippe Rameau. So this is a Baroque work that was first published as a keyboard rondeau in 1728 and was then incorporated into his ballet opera Les Indes Galantes of 1736. Now, I do need to apologize here to anybody who was present at the Goldsmiths conference on translationality and music in May, because this second part, you will already have heard it, sorry. Okay, so, I obviously knew the piece before. It's a very famous piece, but it only really grabbed my attention when I saw it used in a French mini-series, also called Les Sauvages, which was shown on our Portuguese television channel, RTP Deutsch, in 2022. Now, Rameau's music is central to the soundtrack. It's played in multiple variations, but it also serves as a plot device in the sense that the action revolves around it, and also as a metaphor for the immigrant condition in contemporary France. Now, it tells the story of a young boy of Algerian heritage who is a talented musician, and he dreams of entering the Paris Conservatoire. However, at the audition, he decides to play Les Sauvages in his own way. And this displeases the judges, who stop him. They don't even let him finish and tell him not to play an interpretation, to play the original. And this slight is sufficient to precipitate a political crisis. So in this example, we see Rameau at his most canonical as a symbol of France's elite culture. And we see that the judges were acting as gatekeepers to that culture and turning away anyone they thought was undesirable. Now, here I'm interested in the translational origins of Rameau's Les Sauvages. Okay, so as I already mentioned, it was first written as a harpsichord piece in the form of a rondeau, which is a musical form involving a refrain interspersed with episodes called couplets, couplets. To our ears, it seems typically Baroque, ordered, mannered, predictable. It's conventionally organized around three main chords of the diatonic scale, with a simple melodic motif that repeats at different pitches before resolving comfortably back into the tonic. It's usually played allegro with a lot of ornamentation. So predictable. However, right, remember we've got this refrain plus couplets. The second couplet is weird, really strange. Now, I realized that when I started to try to play it, I kept thinking I'd hit a wrong note, because there were all these kinds of strange intervals and unexpected harmonies. And if you've had a classical piano education, there may be people here also have, you're trained on scales and arpeggios. So you've got a muscle memory. So your hand sort of goes naturally into particular positions. And I found my hand was rebelling against this. It didn't want to go there. It wasn't right. Something not right about it. Now, I'm going to play an extract. Hopefully this will work. How did we do it? We put this, it was this. Okay, so I'd like you to listen specifically to the second couplet, okay? But I'll play it from the beginning. Let me see if it will, yeah, it's okay. Oh, they can't see the thing.
No,
You
more.
keep
You got
going.
it. You got
I'm
it.
done with it. Thanks. Okay. Okay. I actually found out later, this was not my imagination. The second couplet is actually weird. Harmonically, it's very strange. We've also got a lot of chromaticism in the left hand. Anyone who knows about music, the left hand, it goes down in, sorry, I'm not supposed to move away from the microphone. Sorry, people online. It moves down in semitones, which was very unusual in the Baroque period. Also, it's in the minor key, which was also unusual at that time. Now, apparently, some of Rameau's contemporaries felt the same way. He got a lot of negative feedback about it. There were all kinds of horrible reviews, calling it a clamour, pure noise. A satirical poem was written about it, where it actually called the music sauvage, savage. Now, we begin to understand this a bit better when we realize that this music itself is actually itself a translation. It's a translation of an Amerindian Calumet dance that Rameau heard and saw at the Théâtre Italien in Paris in September 2025. He saw it performed by a pair of Indians who were visiting from Louisiana. Now, we know about this from a letter that he wrote to Antoine Oudard de la Motte in 1727. He was attempting to convince the librettist to work with him on an opera. And in doing so, he lists his achievements as if laying out his curriculum vitae. And about halfway down, there's this reference to Les Sauvages, where he says, "You have only to come and hear how I have characterized the song and the dance of the savages who appeared at the Théâtre Italien 2 years ago." Now, there is separate textual evidence testifying to the fact that such a performance did indeed take place in the Théâtre Italien. An article published in the Mercure de France in September 1725 describes it like this. So 2 savages recently arrived from Louisiana. They danced 3 sorts of dances in a manner that left no doubt that they'd learned their steps and leaps very far from Paris. What they meant to depict is undoubtedly very easy to understand in their country, but here nothing is more difficult to penetrate. So how did Rameau translate it? Well, his piece, his keyboard piece, does have some characteristics that some scholars believe to be attempts to iconically represent what he actually heard. And they point to ethnomusicological studies of Amerindian music today, such as those by Francis Densmore I mentioned earlier, which suggests that these characteristics still exist. So one is the use of ostinato, which is a repeated rhythm. There was this kind of very strong rhythm going along. There's also the chromaticism that I pointed out in the left hand. There is a series of falling melodic arcs in the second couplet, and also the use of the minor key. Francis Densmore mentions that the minor third interval is incredibly frequent in the melodic progression of Amerindian ethnic music. Other musicologists, on the other hand, they don't feel that there's anything empirical about this. They suggest it's just a stylized attempt at musical exoticism, that Rameau basically just wanted to create something that was a bit strange sounding, while continuing to work within the constraints of the galant style of his day. In addition, I think we need to read this work within the context of the discourses on savagery that have been swirling around since the 16th century. It's not just the noble savage myth of Montaigne, but there was also a more aggressive discourse that portrayed the savage as a threat to the neoclassical order of 17th century France. And then there was the querelle des Lullistes et des Ramistes, which ran between 1735 and 1750. This is a musical quarrel between supporters of Jean-Baptiste Lully, who at this point represented the traditional French aesthetic, and he was supported by the Royal Academy of Music, which later became the Conservatoire, versus Rameau, who at this point was seen as harmonically and stylistically innovatory. Now, in what follows, I'm going to look at some musical translations of Les Sauvages done at different times. Now, the first of these was a self-translation at the hands of the composer himself, when the harpsichord piece was incorporated into an opera ballet, Les Indes Galantes, in 1736. So with this translation, the piece was fully orchestrated, it was set to words, and it was choreographed. Now, Les Indes Galantes had been created 2 years before with librettist Louis Fuselier, but it had not been very successful up till now. However, when Les Sauvages was added in 1736, it turned it all around completely. It became very, very popular. There were multiple performances for nearly 40 years, up to 1773, both as an integral part of Les Indes Galantes, but also as a spectacle coupé for inclusion in the composite operatic programs that were popular in 18th century Paris. Now, this opera ballet celebrates styles of courtship in different locations, with different entrées or acts set in Turkey, Peru, Persia, and now also in the North American forest. So it is presented as a golden age narrative. So it partakes of the myth of the noble savage. Then, following the success of Les Indes Galantes, Les Sauvages now became subject to multiple iterations. There were arrangements by other composers for different instruments, strings, organ, flute, guitar, etc. There were variations on the theme when other composers would expand it for instrumentalists of different levels of technical proficiency. There were some staged parodies involving choreography, such as Favar's, this one here, Favar's vaudeville version of 1751, and also the Divertissement by the Gardel brothers in 1786. However, from 1752, Rameau became embroiled in another mediatic conflict, which pitted traditional French musical culture against a new influence that had emerged in the form of an Italian theatre company, which arrived in Paris that year, bringing a new style of opera, the opera bouffe, which was lighter and less embellished. So this quarrel was known as the Querelle des Bouffons. It now placed Rameau, who was, by this time he was an old man, on the side of a particularly French musical culture that was rapidly going out of fashion. What's more, there was a political dimension to the dispute. The new style, the Italian style, was supported by the philosophes, Diderot, d'Alembert, Rousseau, on the grounds that it represented a new ideological current, one that would eventually come to fruition with the Revolution, 1789. So contrary to the role that it had in the earlier Querelle des Lullistes Ramistes, Rameau was now seen as a symbol of the Ancien Régime. Indeed, after the Revolution, he fell out of fashion altogether and was barely played in Paris for nearly 100 years. It was only after the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, where by the time it had shifted the balance of power in Europe and Romanticism was lighting the first sparks of the early music revival, only now was Rameau rediscovered and co-opted to serve as France's answer to Germany's J.S. Bach, in the creation of a nationalistic program of building an operatic museum to house the glories of the nation. This is a virtual museum. So how did this revival take place? So the first stage was the editing of Rameau's complete works. Now this was undertaken by the music publisher Durand. It lasted nearly 30 years, from 1894 to 1924. And it was approached as a matter of national pride, as a way for France to display her cultural prowess alongside other European nations. And Rameau was seen as representative of a time when French opera was still unsullied by foreign musical styles. Now, this nationalistic impulse also spilled over into the editorial act itself. The whole project was overseen by Camille Saint-Saëns, but individual volumes were edited by other figures of the period, including Dandy, Ducasse, Debussy, Hahn. And what's more, these editors were themselves using the œuvre complète as a way to further their own patriotic narratives. They were all trying to position themselves as Rameau's successor. So some of the editorial decisions actually emphasized features of his work that were similar to things they used themselves in their own compositions. However, there were problems with editing Rameau at the fin de siècle. The main problem was a translational one: how to simultaneously remain faithful to the manuscripts of Rameau's compositions, while at the same time fulfilling the remit of bringing them to a larger audience and facilitating public performance of his work. There were technical impediments. The 18th century chamber orchestrations involving strings and harpsichord sounded really weak and thin in these massive 19th century concert halls. And there were also problems with vocal ranges. Castratos were no longer available, for example. And there were aesthetic impediments. Baroque ornamentation had fallen out of fashion. It now seemed really excessive to modern tastes. Some editors chose modernization. They removed or reduced the ornamentation. And they transposed the vocal parts to suit modern vocal ranges. Dandy, for example, famously added new voices in the keyboard works to flesh out the texture. Others preferred to remain more faithful to the original, although it was not easy to determine which of the many extant autograph manuscripts actually was the original. There were also translational problems for performance. When Rameau's operas finally began to be staged again, directors were faced with interpretative decisions similar in all respects to those facing the editors of the œuvre complète. So should they aim for a historically faithful spectacle, complete with 18th century costumes, sets, and stage machinery? Or would it be better to modernize aspects of the performance so as to not alienate audiences who were unprepared for this kind of musical archaeology? For all of these reasons, it was actually some time before Rameau actually appeared again on the stage of the Paris Opera. In the post-colonial climate that we live in today, Les Sauvages is ideologically rather problematic, as I think you probably will have realized by now. So unsurprisingly, there have been some very creative translations in multiple media. This one, the one down in the bottom corner, is actually the piece you heard. I played it. It's a version of the keyboard piece by badass virtuoso Jean Rondeau, which is actually quite musically conventional in musical terms. But you see, he's sitting in jeans, barefoot, in an empty Baroque palace, playing a remarkably colourful painted harpsichord. Then we've got the video Rameau Rocks by opera singer Dimitri Ivanche. Now, this is basically an animation. You can find it on YouTube, which shows a Baroque museum, and this is Baroque spelled B-A-R-O-C-K, Baroque museum, where portraits of Rameau on the walls actually come to life and begin to play. And then the music becomes gradually heavier and heavier and ends with a rock solo on electric violin. And then up there, there's choreography. This is a hip-hop version of the Danse du Grand Calumet from Les Indes Galantes that was performed at the Paris Opera in 2019. So as you can see from the picture, it involves a racially diverse crew in hoodies, mostly, with tattoos, stamping, kicking, clenched fists, fierce expressions. So it owes very little to the noble, savage stereotype of les Indes galantes. It's a post-colonial appropriation, even though the actual music, is very conventional. Then we've got the soundtrack to the mini-series by French composer Robin Couder. And in this, Rameau's theme has been reworked, mostly electronically, into an entire soundtrack. Okay, so all of these operations, the representation of Amerindian music in Rameau's own idiom, the conversion of the harpsichord piece to ballet opera, the arrangements and the variations on his theme by other composers, the editing of his manuscripts to create the complete works, the various performances and interpretations, the adaptations to other media, and the use of his work as a symbol of France's elite culture in the mini-series Les Sauvages. All of these are translation maneuvers, analogous in all respects to what happens in conventional interlingual translations, and as such can be studied using the same concepts, tools, and theories as we use in translation studies. Thank you.